Let's move into the second block of this first lecture. And I will begin this with a word that is used in everyday speech nowadays in a couple of different contexts. The most common of them is in the world of desks and offices. And I have often had colleagues walk into my office that is generally not very organized. It's pretty cluttered. And as is proper to many people who work in the academy, the surface of the table is covered by layers upon layers of papers, usually unsorted, books, and other sundry objects of so-called clean work, white-collar work. And my colleague will comment to me and say, the layer of culture on your table is pretty deep by now. The Estonian word is kulttuurikiht. And what they really mean by that is not anything like high, educated, elevated thinking, but culture is stuff. Culture is vegetative layers of masses of material. So to talk about kulttuurikiht in this context of papers on a table is playfully derogatory, sort of like you gotta lessen the culture a little bit, take the layers of vegetation off. However, if we transpose the term to another level in which it is used to talk about cultural history, then the word kulttuurikiht is a synonym for the density, often of textual culture, but perhaps in a broader sense, the density of available data, material data, things, substances, reports, and texts, images, photographs, and other semiotic evidence about a way of life in a place. So, kulttuurikiht, I propose to you, is a first concept that you can note down as density. And from time to time, you can ask yourself about its significance. When we look at a culture such as the Estonian culture, reliably, archaeologists have dated or located settlement in this area for about 2,000 to 2,500 years. However, when we talk about culture as literate culture, the culture of texts and records of practices, we go back to about the 13th century. And the density of cultural history thus, when compared, say, at any chosen date, we can arbitrarily make a cut, say in the year 1776, 1789, 1850. If we make a cut into the museum archive, into the textual archive, we will find that the cut that we can make into the culture that has amassed the physical evidence of culture in Estonia is going to be not quite as thick as if we performed the same experiment in Finland, Spain, Germany, or France. So what do we do with that realization? That we're talking about a published literary tradition that doesn't go back any farther than the first quarter of the 16th century, with a few exceptions. That we don't have a literary tradition, say, of the novel in written Estonian prior to about 1875. How does that compare with an inquiry into English language literary traditions, or German language literary traditions. We're talking about, in Estonian cultural terms then, a less dense, a sparser layering of textual culture. And that, to the researcher, means somewhat more restricted means of access to a picture of the way things used to be, the way life used to be lived, and also perhaps a little bit more caution in the kinds of conclusions that one can draw. So one of the three concepts I'd like you to retain or to keep on your desktop for this lecture, for this block, is this notion of density of cultural history, the kultuurikiht, as it were, and the difference that that makes in looking at a way of life or ways of living, practices of living, as we try to go from the contemporary moment into a trajectory of the past. The second concept I'd like you to retain, and if you listened carefully in the first segment, then you probably already suspected that the word hybridity was going to be around the corner, and along with it, the term bricolage. The term bricolage was already evoked, I think, by the coherent fragmentarium concept, the idea that, yes, we have pieces from a culture. They can be artifacts, they can be material objects of daily life, they can be practices, they can be texts or pictures, and we can experience them as blips on a screen, as signs, but we hope to integrate them into some kind of connected fragmentarium, some kind of coherence that we impose on them in order to understand how they might most relevantly belong together. So bricolage was a term that already might have come to some of your minds as we mentioned this coherent fragmentation. But hybridity, a term used today with almost no critical sense, but a term that comes from cultural studies and figures very prominently in post-colonial studies, is a term that claims that there is no pure and authentic, recoverable ancient culture. That through the process of, and this is your third concept, cultural contact between peoples, violent contact, oppressive contact, sometimes peaceful exchange, also traveling, whether that traveling is forced or chosen. Through cultural contacts, practices and customs become irretrievably and irreversibly mixed, so that we really aren't, at least in contemporary terms, in any kind of position to reconstruct a pure original. You may argue with that passionately, if you wish. There are long traditions of scholarship that seek to reclaim for Estonian culture a golden age of pre-colonization existence, when Estonians were heroes, when they were Vikings and they traveled the seas and fought other bands of Vikings, and even in the year 1217, as it is, at least at one point in the pre-colonization era, they even conquered the walled city of Sigtuna in Sweden. That is one heroic myth of the Estonian past that has a little bit of historical evidence, not enough to be uncritically accepted, but at least there are such little tales of heroism that extend into the Baltic Sea region. Even with the serious quest for a pure and unadulterated ancient past, we have to reckon with the existence of cultural contacts, and thus with a culture that is hybridized, that has significantly integrated the foreign, and what is equally important to say, refused to appropriate other things. When scholars of anthropology look at processes of cultural exchange, one of the things they pay attention to very closely is the kind of topic that for many students causes their eyes to glaze over rather quickly, and that is the study of linguistic borrowings, loanwords, words that have been taken over sometimes into a larger language from a smaller language and vice versa. And so words that would be likeliest to be traded or required for communication at the interface between cultures often have to do with things like implements, tools. And tools such as farm implements, you will read in your Vires book and the Rank book about farm implements such as harrows and plows for plowing the earth, and harvesting tools such as the scythe and the sickle. And scholars of the sedentary agricultural way of life that prevailed in the Estonian region for the past 2,000 years are curious about words referring to these implements, where these words come from, and the in-migration and the out-migration of the words, because it goes without saying almost that if you have in your language the word for something, and it is a tool or implement, then that tool or implement at one time was in use. And things are better for the scholar, of course, when there are actual examples that have been dug up out of the earth or portrayed by some visual means. There is some evidence of that implement itself having been used. And if you can physically dig it out of the ground, then you can begin to do something with this conjunction of the loanword and the actual implement. So, density of the cultural historical layer, the Kulturgicht, the inevitability of hybridization, and the existence and dynamics of cultural contacts mean that once again we're faced with a cultural situation in which there are numerous contact points between the sedentary agricultural population, which made up of most of the Estonian population for most of these past 2,000 years, and then the others that invaded, took over, and controlled the tilling of the land. If we talk about the Estonian culture then as primarily a culture of farmers, we have to add immediately to the farming, to the tilling of land and the way that the land was tilled, the keeping of farm animals, the herding of farm animals, sheep and horses, oxen, and some goats, and of course, cattle. The source of additional food, meat, dairy products, and the source of textile fabrics for making clothing. One might ask then, if Estonia had, as it once did, and in some places still does, significant forest coverage, what about those disciplines and those practices associated with using the resources of the forest? Rank and Vires point out, and you will read about this, that despite the fact that there were traditions of hunting among Estonian farmers, hunting larger animals was mostly passive for most of the time of sedentary agriculture, and the passivity of hunting made Estonian culture rather different from some of the Finno-Ugric tribes that share a linguistic heritage with Estonian language. And these tribes along the Ob River in Siberia and extending into the Siberian Arctic, the Finno-Ugric tribes in those regions were intensive hunters, much more nomadic in their way of life. Much of those traditions have been maintained by certain tribes up until the present day. So a culture focused on bear hunting or other large animals required a different kind of way of life, a semi-nomadic mode of habitation. But for the majority of people living in the area that is now Estonia, hunting involved protecting one's cattle and one's inhabitants from predators such as foxes and wolves, and this included then hunting tactics that were largely trapping oriented. So if you look at the vocabulary for hunting animals in the Estonian language, you will see that there is a great deal of vocabulary for trapping wolves and trapping foxes, but the traditional fox hunt that drove the fox through the woods, and that was a leisure sport of the Baltic German barons, was in fact confined to the gentry, to the gentleman's realm of existence. That is, hunting for fun was not something that the Estonian peasant had any time or any particular use for. So the sedentary agriculture, supplemented by herding, meant that hunting was a pastime that was both defensive and sometimes preemptive, but not something that one did as a leisure sport. Fishing, which again, if one looks at food traditions in Estonia, one might ask, well, look at how much of the coastline is suggestive of fishing activity, and look at the number of lakes and rivers that might suggest fishing activity. Did Estonians fish? They did, to supplement their diet, and particularly Gustav Renck, in whose book you will see examples and photographs of fishing implements. That was one of his specialties, being from the island of Saaremaa. One of his first ethnographic projects was to look at the fishing tackle and fishing implements of island folk as compared to coastal folk on the north and west coasts of Estonia and the western shores of Lake Peipus. Renck observes that sea fishing, again, for island people, was a supplement to basically a life of sedentary agriculture. Men did go to sea in the springtime and caught enough fish to last them a year, and then came back and spent the rest of the harvesting season, the rest of the agricultural season, working the land. So fishing was a supplementary activity. The exception then was the Russian villages along the coast of Lake Peipus that had a much more developed culture of fishing. And so in the area we mentioned in the last lecture already briefly, in the culture of Setomaa, very often people would buy their fish from the Lake Peipus fishermen, ethnically Russian, and again, we ask about that situation, immediately focusing onto it linguistically and say, well, what language did they trade in? How did the folks in Setomaa purchase the fish from the Russian fishermen? And one, again, is faced with a kind of mini multiculturality that tends to get ignored in later accounts of Estonian culture. So again, the three local languages. The second language sometimes meaning a broadening of one's capacity to trade. But again, looking at the way of life, fishing then as a supplementary rather than as a primary mode of existence and feeding. Having mentioned that most of the history of Estonian culture is a life of sedentary agriculture, we can ask another rather obvious question or make an obvious observation. If one is engaged in intensive agriculture in a climate such as that of Estonia, and if you are a foreign student temporarily in Estonia and have not lived in Estonia before, you have probably had occasion to observe what life is like climatically from about the end of October until about, say, conservatively, then the beginning of April. Sedentary agriculture and the activities that it entails to sustain life in a climate such as that of Estonia mean that the growing season is short and the grazing season needs to begin sometime around the 1st of April. And in the folk calendar, a construct, a way of looking at the yearly circuit of activities on the agricultural calendar, blended in with all kinds of ethnic customs that come along with that, and superstitions or beliefs, depending on how one looks at it, then the beginning of the agricultural year is when it gets warm enough to go outside and the ground is not in frost anymore. You can begin to dig it up. You can begin to plant. Not potatoes if it's before the middle of the 19th century, but after the middle of the 19th century, potatoes, a very suspect crop at first. But you begin to prepare your ground for grain planting, barley and rye being the primary crops, and flax as a plant that grows easily on the kind of soil that much of Estonia is made up of, not exactly the most fertile soil in the world. So the 1st of April would begin to be the initiation of agricultural activities, and around the 23rd of April, which is in the folk calendar referred to as St. George's Day, your little bell should ring that we are now talking about a cultural hybridization event. The feast of the Saint of St. George, the feast of St. George defeating the dragon, comes from Western Catholicism and is a Christian feast. But for the agricultural calendar, particularly in the 18th and 19th centuries, it meant the day at which one went to the marketplace and got oneself seasonal workers to help with the intensive part of the agricultural year. Helpers, that is farmhands, and as well as women who would work and help do the women's part of the labor. And the 23rd of April was the day that one made the agreements that lasted until the next year on the 23rd of April for people who were going to be farmhands as well as herders, young people who would go to a different farm than where they lived and in return for their labors be fed and clothed for the period of their labor, and usually given some natural products, clothing, a couple of items of clothing perhaps, and some bushels of rye or barley to take home as remuneration for their work. And as we move then with the agricultural calendar onward, we move to the next date that most people would know about, and that is the summer solstice, the feast of St. John, Midsummer Night's Eve. Again, a hybrid date on the Christian calendar, a feast day of a saint, St. John the Baptist in this case, and a period of celebration. So as we look at any culture, Estonian culture included, one of the questions that students of culture ask is, where do we see the lines of separation or continuity between everyday life and the life of festival, ordinary life and celebration, going around the daily round of work activities and stopping work in order to take leisure to celebrate any aspects of life and the continuity of life. So around the 22nd to the 24th of June, right around the high point of the haying season and before the harvest, people would take time off to celebrate the highest point of light. the brightest point in the yearly cycle of light and darkness. And a solstice as a major astronomical point in the year then becomes clustered with various kinds of rituals, fertility rituals, rituals in celebration of the light, and rituals of the continuity of light. Certain things are eaten and drunk. There is partying and dancing. There is a sense of mystery in young people celebrating their youth, the romantic partnerships, looking for confirmation or good signs and good omens, and also fertility rituals celebrated for the cattle and the earth. And one might ask, very fruitfully, as a topic that has really not been studied as intensively as one might think, how different are the traditions around solstice celebrations in Estonia and Latvia? And if one has any sense of geography, one knows that the borderline, the physical border between Latvia and Estonia, has only been a state border on two periods or two occasions. One was, again, the interwar period when Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania were independent republics. There was a legal political border between them. And at the beginning of the post-Soviet period, a border was reestablished, a border point was reestablished, a legal border between Estonia and Latvia. But for most of the history of the region, for most of those 700 years, there was no legal border at the Gauja River. Rather, the boundary between two administrative units, the provinces in the Russian Empire, the province of Estonia and the province of Livonia, ran through the middle of Estonia around the town of Põltsamaa. So again, boundaries aren't necessarily always maintained, and linguistic boundaries very seldom configure themselves exactly congruently with state boundaries. And so one can reasonably ask, this is an excellent research topic, whether the traditions of celebrating Jaani, which is the Feast of St. John, Midsummer Night's Eve, in Latvia, have any resemblance to the Feast of St. John as it is celebrated as Jaanipäev in Estonia. And one might say that if one looks closely at folk songs from the southern part of Estonia, then one does see in festival songs for Midsummer Night's Eve the word liigu, liigume, a word that resembles very closely a very often repeated formula in Latvian songs for St. John's Eve, liigue. I'm not probably pronouncing it absolutely accurately, but the refrain of almost every song for the Feast of St. John, for Jaani in Latvia, ends with or begins with these words, liigue. And it is a word associated with moving or making a procession, moving collectively from one place to another, from the village to the site of the bonfire. From the village through the fields, traversing the fields with whatever one carries on such an occasion, fresh branches or torches, or wearing certain clothing, or singing a certain song. So there are continuities at these boundary points, even if the typical Estonian speaker would not be able to understand thoroughly every word of the Latvian St. John's Eve song. But back to the agricultural calendar, practices then of festival, of celebration that interrupt this long work season configure a high point on the astronomical calendar with a resting point in work, and surround these dates with various practices of ritual magic. And As we move on in the course, we will come back to these points and look at some of the layers of ritual as concerns hypotheses about ancient religion or folk religion, and ask ourselves how religious were some of these practices and what these religious meanings might be. Moving on, though, with the agricultural calendar around the year, we have other dates on that calendar. The harvest season, after the haying season, the harvesting of grain soon begins. And by the end of September, by St. Michael's Day, much of the harvesting has to be completed because the weather is now shifting, often quite drastically, becoming colder and rainier. And another hybrid feast day comes up, the feast day of St. Michael, or Michaelmas. And the feast of St. Michael, the 29th of September, again a Christian feast day in the Catholic calendar, comes to mean and signify for the agricultural folks one difficult transition for a child, and that is the slaughtering of pigs. Many memoirs of farm children in Estonia speak of the lonely and boring experience of being out with the cattle, sometimes as a pig herder, sometimes as watching over the cows and seeing that they don't get into the swamps and marshes, or shepherding sheep. But a traumatic experience, a sad experience for many, a small child is watching or participating in the slaughtering of a pig. And that is often done at Michaelmas, when the pig has had a chance to nourish itself throughout the long growing season. The pig is slaughtered, the meat is salted or smoked, and prepared for the long winter as a supplementary source of nutrition. And there is even a popular saying, a kind of proverb that says, for every pig there is St. Michael's Day. So for every endeavor there is a day of reckoning or a day of slaughter when one weighs in with the final weight. So again, the agricultural calendar attaches customs, even sayings, to certain dates. And a final marker on the calendar then, two final markers on the calendar as we go in its primary form through the major holidays, then includes Martinmas or Martipäev, which is in the middle of November, the 15th of November on the church calendar, at which point the agricultural season is completely over. And what has happened between the harvest itself, between, say, September and November, is the process of threshing the grain. And here are two more words for your vocabulary list and one image, still image, for your gallery or your repertoire of still images. And this is the Kiln House, also referred to as the unchimneyed barn dwelling. So there are two words. One is used in the translation of Ansviras's work, which is the barn dwelling, and the Gustav Renk's chosen term is the Kiln House. And images of the Kiln House, which you will see in your PowerPoint slides, indicate a type of dwelling that Estonian farm folk, Estonian agricultural folk, lived in really up until the middle of the 19th century, when it began to be replaced by a different kind of dwelling. And in the Kiln House, the dwelling quarters of the people adjoin the threshing barn, which is kept warm by a kiln, and the grain that has been harvested and put into preliminary formations to let it dry is beaten with flails and then threshed. And the valuable grain is gathered up and stored in barrels and hopefully protected and sealed so that it neither gets wet and goes rotten, nor does it suffer from mice and other kinds of creatures that might want to prey on it. So the closing of the agricultural year is labor intensive because the grain must be threshed, the meat products prepared for the long winter, and all of this is taking place as the weather gets colder and colder, and it gets darker and darker. So closing out the agricultural year then with the winter solstice, St. Martin's Day, which has its own magical traditions that we will return to, including traditions that for many North Americans are attached more significantly to the cross-quarter festival of the 31st of October, alias Halloween. So there are masking traditions running around from house to house and performing tricks and asking for alms. So the Halloween traditions for North Americans really belong in the repertoire of St. Martin's Day, and there's yet another festival, St. Catherine's Day, that is closely associated. That will be mentioned in a different context. But the winter solstice is a time of celebration, of rest and celebration, and that time in Estonian Jõulud, the Christian Christmas, is a time that then inaugurated the coming of the season when people stayed mostly indoors, doing minimal tending of their animals, and the indoor activities became intensive for both men and women. For men in the preparation of implements, mostly wooden implements, both for food and the repairing of tools, and women doing the textile work, spinning and weaving in the light of the fire and the slats that were burned for additional lighting. So life indoors in the winter season is then anchored in place by the Christmas celebration, a time of plenty when one still had enough to eat in a good year, and one celebrated with more elaborate meals, when meat was eaten and a period of rest was imposed. And then the next quarter of the year is a time of indoor work and building up one's physical reserves for the next labor-intensive season. So what I've outlined in the last few minutes for you is what is referred to as the folk calendar, the rahvakalender. And we might ask skeptically whether such a concept such as the folk calendar really exists as a kind of whole, or whether it is the construction of the anthropologist, whether it is really something that is put together by students of the culture. Would a farmer walk around with a concept in his or her head of something like a folk calendar, or would these dates be kinds of reference points that were not necessarily connected? Well, in one level, the answer is obvious, because these processes, even the work processes, are logical extensions of one another. They are parts of one long cycle of events. If we take one of them away, there is no coherent way of agricultural maintenance at all. So the processes create the whole. However, the additional observances, the way that the dates in the agricultural calendar, the transitions in the agricultural year, connect with the church calendar and the feasts of the church calendar is a larger issue. And then we are confronted with a necessary hybridity. If we start examining folk songs, if we start examining practices and evidence that we have of customs that people used, if we talk to older people who remember oral traditions about these practices, then what we have is a puzzle that is ready-made, because our oral tradition does not extend back into the 12th century or the 10th century, even if one looks at the archaeological record. So the folk calendar as a complex construct made up of customs, observances, songs, and practices then supplements the logic of the agricultural process with multiple layers that need disentangling. And here, again, we must enlarge our focus and not pretend that the Estonian people lived a life totally separate from other peasant peoples elsewhere in Europe, and that they are the only place where there was significant hybridization between Christian and folk religion. So again, we are looking at a concept. If we add a third level of coherence to the folk calendar, then we can look at a series of books that Mal Hiiämaa, a senior member of the anthropological cadre in Estonia, has made her life work to put together a series of books that span the entire year, the agricultural year, with various traditions from around the Estonian territory, very heterogeneous traditions, sometimes even contradictory sayings, focused around these major dates on the folk calendar and other minor festivals. If you go into a bookstore today and you're interested in this topic, go to the calendar section and you will see a number of calendars, not just one, on the market that are put out by societies interested in the folk religion of Estonia, by the Estonian National Museum, and by local museums that are devoted to agricultural life, such as the Karilatsi Museum in southern Estonia and the Rocca al Mare Open Air Museum. And you will see that on those calendars, available for general purchase, you have examples of the noting of these lesser dates from the folk calendar, and using your search motors and other tools, you can focus in on some of these other layers of customs and traditions. So the folk calendar is both a minimal and a maximal holistic concept, and whether or not a farmer conceptualized it as such, it made sense. And if we go to the textual history, the cultural level, the Kulturgicht, then we also find that in a branch of popular literature that became extremely well and widely marketed in the early 19th century and even somewhat earlier, the so-called calendars or almanacs meant for farmers. They cost only a few pennies or a few kopecks of money. Farmers' almanacs, familiar to some of you from other traditions, would include the cycles of the moon and would include these dates on the folk calendar. So even in textual form, the folk calendar circulated among agricultural people sometime in the early 19th century. It was reinforced by this textual feedback. A couple of more observations around the farm calendar, and these focus now on the Kiln House, and this is a short quotation from Gustav Rank's book, Old Estonia. You will have this passage as part of your reading, and it's also on the PowerPoint slide. And again, try to imagine yourself into this still picture, this location of a farm dwelling, adjacent to which there is a threshing barn, and what life would look like there, say sometime in the month of September during the active threshing period. The Estonian kiln house has several typical features, among which are the poles for drying grain, which remains under the ceiling on the thick beams year-round. After the threshing season was over, the poles were pushed together into two tight groups, one of them against the rear wall, the other in the middle of the room. These groups of poles were used in general for drying firewood, and in some places they were also used for sleeping. The space above the poles was called the kiln house box, rehekast. In addition to the poles, the kiln house contained a pair of thicker poles or beams which reached from one side wall to the other across the stoves. In some places, they were replaced by a pair of regular poles for drying grain, which was set higher above the stove for the winter. The poles were called splinter poles, piiru õrred, since the logs for splinters were set on them to dry. We'll come back to these splinters in a minute. Moreover, meat also was hung on them for smoking. The floors of the older kiln houses were made of clay or of a mixture of clay and gravel, which was tamped down, or were made of flagstone. In later times, especially in the second half of the 19th century, the kiln houses were often furnished with a wooden floor, but in front of the door and the stove, the layer of clay or stone was still preserved. And what you have just heard is the beginning of a thick description, as anthropologist Clifford Geertz has called it, a thick description of the place, the happening place, for the major activity of nourishing oneself. A description of the physical construction of that place, from its ceiling to its floor. Sometimes ethnographic descriptions such as this one, especially if they're unaccompanied by pictures, can become rapidly boring for some of us. But understanding cultural history really requires us to go back to this old-fashioned way of imagining oneself into this kind of space. A museum visit to one of the reconstructed kiln houses would be nice, of course, perhaps not in this season yet, but interesting also is the imaginative activity of taking the picture and the description and attempting to put them together. That might be sufficient for you for the time being. I stopped for a moment at the word piiru, meaning splinter, and this is an occasion for clarification of one of two final aspects in this lecture that connects with daily life. French anthropologist and social historian Daniel Roche has written a book called L'Histoire des choses banales, in English translation, The History of Everyday Things, in which he focuses on two often forgotten aspects of daily life. We can read cultural histories of France, of Germany, of many other places in the world, and easily forget about light and mud. The reason I focused on splinters was that the word piiru or pirru is the word for a splinter of wood, a long splinter of wood, that was the only source of lighting during most of the long dark winter up until about the 1850s. And if one reads, as we will in a few lectures' time, talk about the Estonian national epic, the Kalevipoeg, and the culminating event in the Kalevipoeg at the very end is the magical breaking into flame of splinters. These weak lighted splinters, the only source of light, much weaker than a candle, not even imaginable if one is used to electric light. These barely burning splinters burst into flame at both ends when the hero of the national epic comes bursting out of his bondage. This is magical because splinters only burn at one end for obvious reasons. If you burn them at both ends, they would be too dangerous and they might catch your house on fire. So among the implements in a farmhouse, when one began later to have metal implements for this purpose, was a splinter bracket. A bracket, a metal bracket that was put up on a shelf or close to the ceiling of the house at a safe distance from the roof to put this long splinter into so that its weak light could spread from above and allow a minimal amount of recognition. So, in the spirit of Daniel Roche, lighting inside this kiln house was weak at best. Some of it would come from the fire in the stove, but not enough to read by. The pirro light is also barely enough to recognize the shapes around you, and if one has to do work that is hard on the eyes, and weaving may be a macro activity, but spinning and knitting are micro activities, then I think thinking of the splinter lit kiln house is a pretty good argument for appreciating the skill involved in doing textile crafts, those crafts necessary to clothe your family in the centuries before light. So when I mentioned it was around the 1850s that the lighting situation changed, beloved Estonian author and playwright August Kitzberg, who was born in 1855, not far from Tartu, in a schoolhouse, a country schoolhouse, which included a schoolmaster's farm, not a large farm, but just enough of a farm to grow some potatoes and a little bit of vegetables, notes in his memoirs what a dramatic occasion it was when the schoolhouse got its first petroleum lamp. And this happened in the early 1860s, when he was about a 7-year-old boy. For those of you who know some Estonian cultural history, you will remember one date, perhaps, that is a high point in the movement toward genuine national or popular consciousness, the first Estonian Song Festival in 1869. So 7 years before the big song festival, we're talking about the first petroleum lamps making their appearance. Maybe slightly before if one had a little bit more wealth. Maybe in public buildings slightly earlier. But the petroleum lamp requiring, of course, its own kind of fuel and its own kind of wariness. Because as Kitzberg notes in his memoirs, as he talks about seeing the light in the schoolhouse from a new source under the ceiling for the first time, he notices that very quickly some of the glass shields, the glass vessels protecting the petroleum lamps began to break because the ceiling was pretty low in the schoolhouse, and boys went to school only during the winters, and they were pretty tall by then. So as soon as the new technological innovation is put in place, you have to worry about keeping it from breaking and causing accidents. But I think this imaginative exercise of putting yourself into a kiln house, thinking about the threshing of grain, the process of threshing of grain, the rich repertoire of implements that were used for the process, with the background of low lighting and lots of smoke, will give you, I think, a sensory impression adequate to understanding several hundred years of agricultural history. And the second thing I wanted to mention, I said, was mud. And this is the second kind of perspective I'd like you to retain as you think about the kiln house. Ask yourself, if one is born in a kiln house setting as, say, the 7th child in a large farm family, then how far do you think you would go in a lifetime? If you were born where Kitzberg was, would you, as a child, have a chance to go to town? If you did, you would be probably getting up on a summer night around 3 o'clock in the morning and getting onto a wooden 4-wheeled cart with your father and your mother and other family members, and the cart would be drawn most probably by horses, a horse or two, and the trip from your kiln house to the Tartu market would take approximately 5 hours, 25 kilometers at a rather slow clip, bumping around with the fresh milk from the morning milking and whatever else was being taken to market. And that would probably be the extent of your horizon. So if we are talking about the sedentary agricultural lifestyle of the majority of Estonian people over several centuries, one is talking about the radius that one could walk on foot and the radius that one could travel by the most common farm conveyance, a four-wheeled cart in the time of year when the roads were passable, or a sledge when the roads were passable because they were iced over. And in between, in the two mud seasons of early spring and late autumn, you probably wouldn't go very far at all. So the radius of one's daily life and the conveyance and the speed with which one moved across that radius is a measure of the life world of the Estonian peasant. Very occasional trip to town. And it's the dialectic between town and country that we'll pick up in the next lecture. And we'll also say a few words there about the larger topic of conveyances and communication, because we haven't yet mentioned that the most economical and efficient mode of taking things long distances had nothing to do with roads at all, but with frozen rivers. During the medieval period and most of the 16th and 17th centuries, it was much better to confine your hauling of products along long distances, be it vodka distilled in Russia or in the distillery in one's home manor and being taken to Russia, be it wood and lumber or other products, to the season where one could travel safely over ice. And there were certainly times in the climate of Estonia where you simply couldn't go anywhere at all, not far from your front door. So as we consider the cultural history of Estonia, let us remember small and useful things that generally get forgotten in cultural history: light and movement, light and the condition of the roads. And that's the point at where we will continue with the next block.